Hi, this is Jove Aguas, and welcome once again to these lectures in ethics. So, we are now in the last part, the third part of the fifth lecture on ethical theories. So, for this lecture, the third part of the fifth lecture, we are going to discuss the other theories. In the previous two parts, the last two parts of this lecture, we focused on the teleological theories and then the ontological theories. But there are certain theories about ethics, on ethics rather, that may not fall within those two categories. Okay. Of course, they can still fall within those two categories, but we would set them for a different, for a different category. Right. So the first one here is ethical relativism. Okay, ethical relativism. Well, relativism is the idea that there's nothing that is absolute, meaning there's no absolute truth or there's no universal truth or universal principles, whether that be in ethics, whether that be in culture, whether that be in society, etc., etc. So everything is relative to some. It could be relative to the individual, it could be relative to the culture, it could be relative to a particular religion. In other words, there's no universal truth or universal principle that can be applied to all individuals or to all societies or to all cultures. So that's the main idea of relativism. It depends on the individual, it depends on the society, it depends on the culture, it depends on the religion, etc., etc. Now, when we say ethical relativism, it simply means that there are no universal ethical or moral principles. That means the moral rightness or wrongness of action will vary from society to society or from one social group or one culture to another. So there are no absolute universal moral principles or standards that could be binding on all men in all societies, in all cultures at the same time. So that's the main point of ethical relativism. So the moral rightness of a particular action will depend on that particular society, okay, or in that particular social group. So it holds that whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way may depend on or is relative to the society or culture to which one belongs. So, for example, an ethical relativist would say that, well, in the Philippines, Filipinos have certain way of doing things. They have certain way of behaving. Okay, so whether this particular action is right or wrong will depend on how they do it, on their culture. Okay, so it depends on what could be moral here. For example, for the Filipino may not be moral for some other individuals, for some, an American, for example, or for a Westerner, for example, because uh, you cannot apply the moral principle or the the moral standards that prevail in among the Filipinos, for example, and then apply that to some other people who are not within that particular society or culture. Okay, so uh, you call this conventional ethical relativism. Okay, so what is conventional ethical relativism then? It is the view that there are no objective moral principles that could be used to determine the morality of human actions in a particular social group. Remember, if you're familiar with the saying, when in Rome, do what the Romans do. All right. So the Romans, for example, if you are in a particular society, there is a particular way of doing things, the moral way, the right way of doing things. So when you are there, you have to follow the convention. Okay, you have to follow what other people do. I remember that my lecture on the second level of moral reasoning according to Kohlberg, conventional level of moral reasoning. This is it. So all the valid moral principles are justified by virtue of their social acceptance. So a particular action is morally right if it is socially accepted. Okay? If everybody does this, then you also have to do it because that's the norm. Social acceptance becomes the norm of morality. Okay? So, therefore, we can say that morality has a social character. It is relative to the accepted practices of a certain group or society. Okay? So for example, just for example, if you happen to live or if you happen to go to a nudist camp, okay, everybody is bare, no dress, nude. If you happen to be there, how would you act? It's accepted to be nude. So the point of ethical relativism, well, if you are there, then you have to go by the convention. Okay, social character. So that's conventional ethical relativism. Now, another type of relativism is cultural relativism. Okay, and now this cultural relativism, we can say, should be should well, it belongs to the study of the anthropologists. Okay, remember the lecture on meta ethics. Okay, or I'm sorry, about scientific or descriptive ethics. This is their domain. To talk about the differences among cultures. Okay, so it believes that cultures have different moral codes. Okay, our sense of right and wrong differs from culture to culture. For example, the practice of polygamy may be right in one culture and may be wrong in another. Okay, you heard about the practice of some primitive societies, some primitive people, that they wanted their firstborn to be male. What happens? What do they do if the firstborn is not male? Say meaning female, a girl. Well, they either they kill the firstborn happens to be female because they want the firstborn to be male. Of course, because say that's bad, that's immoral because that's killing. But for this particular group of people, they have their own reason for doing it because they want the firstborn. The reason why they want the firstborn to be male is because, well, the firstborn should be able to help or support the family. And for them, they believe that only a male could support, can provide for the family. Right? So different cultures they have different moral codes. Okay. Now, so cultural relativism is actually a fact. It's a fact. Okay. People or societies or cultures do differ from one another. Okay. So, according to the cultural relativist, there's no universal moral law that governs all cultures. And that should bound every culture to follow, that we have to apply this culture, our laws or moral codes from our culture, and apply them to their cultures because they have different way of living. For them, there is no universal moral law. Therefore, it follows that there is no objective standard that can be used to judge one social code or moral code as better than the other. Let's just leave them. Let's just respect them, how they behave or how they act, because they have different moral systems or moral codes. Okay. So now here is some our more analysis we could take about relativism, whether that is ethical, or cultural. First, it does not follow that simply because there are differences in culture or in what society may accept to be good or bad, that there are no longer universal truth about morality. There may be some differences in the practices, but it does not follow that there's no universal truth about morality. Okay? Because if we're going to use our reason, reason will tell us that there is. It's universal to the general admonition that do good, avoid evil is something that is universal, that is not cultural. Respect for life is also universal. But of course, how we are going to interpret, how we are going to practice these rules will depend on the culture. And that's where the differences lie. Okay? The the primitive societies who happen to kill their firstborn, who happens to be girl or female, still understand that they should not kill. That's why they don't kill the firstborn. But for them, they think that the survival of their family or the society or of their tribe depends on the male. But later on, reason later on, when they develop, when they are able to, use their reason, they will realize that it does not follow that only the belief that only male can provide for the family. Because a firstborn, a girl firstborn, can also do as much. And that's the difference between the primitive society then and the modern society now. Because then we don't, people, well, we are, that's why they are called, they are still in the primitive stage because they don't realize yet that male and female are equal and they can equally provide for the family. But reason evolves, human reason evolves. Okay? It matures. That's why we are no longer doing that because the modern scientist, modern man already understand that male and female can do and can also provide for the needs and sustain survival of the family or of their group. Okay, so there the difference is not in the difference is in the interpretation, but the universal moral truth is the same. Okay, next. If some societies or people do not know the universal moral truth, it does not mean that there are no moral truth. As I've said, the primitive people may not yet understand, fully comprehend the value of human life. Okay? But later on they will understand. Okay? And it doesn't mean that if they don't understand, there's nothing to understand at all. It doesn't mean that if they don't understand the moral truth, then there are no moral truth anymore. Because there is. Okay? There are some moral rules that societies and cultures have in common, and they're here too because they are necessary for the existence of the society and their culture. Okay, so there may be some differences in some, in some rules, but they recognize that they have something in common. Okay, so the differences may be in the application, difference may be in certain ways, but you know there are some rules that are common to all. Okay, it's common to, of course, always think of the survival, you know, of the survival of your society or of your group or of the human race in that sort of manner. So what may be relative is the interpretation and the application of those moral principles in a particular culture or in a particular society. But as to the rule, there is a universal rule. Now, if some societies or some cultures do not recognize or realize it yet, does not follow that there does not mean that There's no such thing. It's just that they don't discover or they don't realize it yet. Okay. Now, let's go to the next, ethical subjectivism. So our moral judgments are based on our feelings and nothing more. Sometimes we call this subjectivism as ethical emotivism. Ethical emotivism. Because we base our moral assertions on our feelings, on our emotions. So whatever moral judgment we make, we are only expressing our personal feelings, and we are just expressing or basing our judgment, moral judgment, on our emotions and sentiments. Hence, morality is primarily based on feelings, on our emotions, on our prejudices. Okay, so when I say uh, I don't like killing, or I don't like corruption, it's just a matter of expressing my disgust. Okay, my disgust towards these actions or towards these acts. So an action is good if it arouses us in us a good feeling or a positive emotion, and if we don't feel good about it, then it's a bad thing. So we, in ethical emotivism or subjectivism, we base our judgment on our feelings. Now, some critique here. If that is the case, it's possible to lead to a conflict or contradiction, especially when sentiments or feelings conflict. Okay? So suppose I feel good about this particular act, but other people don't feel good about it. As in the case of, for example, uh, the extrajudicial killing. Some people feel good about the extrajudicial killing because, according to them, it's a way of, cleaning our street of all these drug addicts, bad elements in the society. Of course, some people don't feel good about it because the extrajudicial killing that is happening is, of course, uh, against basic human rights. So, in this case, whose sentiments or feelings should prevail? If there are conflicting sentiments. Imagine, for example, if in the family there is a conflicting sentiments or feelings about something, right? The husband may feel like, the father may feel like, well, I have to go abroad because I want to, you know, but support the family. But the mother, the wife, does not feel good about the husband leaving. So if you're going to base our, our judgment, moral judgment on feelings, whose sentiments should be followed? And we have to remember that feelings and sentiments are transitory. One day you feel good about it, tomorrow you may not feel good about it. Imagine if in a relationship, for example, we are going to base our decision in when it comes to relationship to our emotions. So one day you are madly in love with somebody. So you give yourself to that somebody, your whole self. And then the following morning or the following day or the following weeks or months, your feelings change because feelings can be transitory. So what now? So we cannot use our emotions, our feelings, the sole norm or basis of our moral decisions. We need to account for reason, and we must be able to present reasons why we are doing this. And we cannot just say, well, I'm doing it because I feel good about it. What about if next time you don't feel good about it anymore? What happens? Okay. So that's one problem with emotivism. Now let's go to ethical egoism. I know we have already discussed this, but let me just give my analysis and critique about ethical egoism because I've said, well, to some extent, we are all egoists, right? Because we all love ourselves. We all want to promote our own good, our own interest. We always think that the right action is at least the action that will give a great balance of good for us in the long run. Okay? So everyone should always act in his own self-interest regardless of the interest of others, unless, of course, their interests also serve ours. So the primary obligation of a person is himself. And I already said that to some extent, we are all that egoist. We all learn how to love ourselves. Because that's the greatest love of all, according to the song. One of the proponents of this theory is Ayn Rand. He's an American uh, philosopher, a woman, who stresses that as rational beings, we must act on our rational self interest, and we should not think of the interests of others unless, of course, those interests serve our interest. Okay? Now, the problem with this kind of theory is that it can be inconsistent and it cannot provide solutions to conflict of interest. Okay? What happens when everybody wants to promote his or her own self interest? And what happens if my interest conflicts with the interest of others? How do we resolve that? Okay? How do we resolve that? If I'm only thinking of my own self interest, what about the interest of others? And what happens if his interest goes directly against mine? Okay? Now, since according to ethical egoism, it should be the interest of the person that should prevail, then it tends to be arbitrary because it assigns greater importance on one's interest over that of the others. When in general, there's no difference between my interest and the interest of others. So it becomes rather arbitrary. It's not just egoistic, it's self centered. See? So there's the danger of falling into a system where people will simply be manipulated by others just to promote their own self interest. So imagine the politician, for example, who may pretend to be helping the poor, altruism, see, helping the poor, but in the end, he is not really helping the poor because he's just trying to, project a good image to other people. So what happens is that people, the poor especially in this case, are just manipulated for the sake of the politician's self-interest. And we see a lot of people, okay, who are into this kind of thinking, into this kind of attitude. Okay. So that's the three other theories that I want to discuss. And I hope you have, gained some understanding about this, especially the nuances of these of these theories, because again, we still consider them to be part of the different theories that people may follow in their moral decisions and in their moral judgments. Right. So I hope you understand the discussion, and to further deepen our understanding of this, I have these questions for discussions. Number one, in determining the moral or ethical value or character of an action, do you think we should also consider its social character? Well, people do consider the social character, meaning the social acceptance of our action. So, do you think we should consider that? And actually, I just thought of a better question in relation to that. What should prevail? The social character of the action or the consequences of the action? Or the duty? Just to connect this to the two other lectures. Number two, in a world that is rapidly changing, do you think moral values and principles are still relevant? Do you think it's still relevant, to hold on to our moral values? The world is rapidly changing. Okay, given of course, well, technology, you know, the convenience that science and technology can give us. Number three, given the current pandemic that we are experiencing right now, what valuable insights have you learned from the different theories? Just one particular insight. So you can choose any of the theories that we've discussed and think of a good insight, how we are going to act, behave during this pandemic. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. That ends the fifth lecture. So uh, wait for the sixth lecture. Actually, the sixth lecture with in the general introduction part of this course. Okay, so thank you very much.